Dan Fleckless going to give a little intro here.
We've seen a lot of predictions here at CQA. Nuria Rubini made a great prediction and predicted a market crash right before it happened. Here at CQA, we heard early discussions of Twitter, the rise of cryptocurrency. Some predictions sounded very early. Some sounded very wrong, but most remarkably turned out very well. These predictions were like fire alarms, and most people who were in charge actually slept through. So during the market crash, a lot of the markets, when they were falling in 2008, they were falling together. And diversification promised us a free lunch, but it stood us up. Now, when we have increased globalization, markets are actually falling apart. In 2010, Ray Kurzweil was right here at the Wind, and he spoke about nanobots in our body monitoring our internal systems, and that future seemed far away, but that technology, which has moved from the edges, is actually going towards the center, and that prediction looks pretty good today. And we also, CQA winner Ed Thorpe showed us what it's like to perceive noise from a structure that, something that doesn't appear to have any structure. But he and Claude Shannon, who was mentioned earlier, showed that noise is actually a signal that helps us in gambling and later finance. So now we're at AI, and everyone thinks that they found something, and it shows up in their back test. But that's when the signal stops and becomes an alpha, and that starts to become marketing. So that's where the problem changes, and that's the moment that Milind Sharma, who's speaking today, focuses on. He uses signals as building blocks that you could combine stress and scale. Milind has been working on this problem for many years. He's run prop desks, he's built funds, he's applied machine learning before it became fashionable, and he's the CEO of QuantZ and Quantitative in New York, and he's been building systems around these ideas for many years. In his new book, The Quantamental Revolution, he asked the simple question, if AI can generate a signal, then what's left for the rest of us to do? For years, the edge was in finding signals that nobody else had, but now the edge is knowing what signals you could trust, that since everybody already has them. Because once a signal is crowded, it stops being information and it becomes price. So please give a warm welcome to Milind Sharma, my friend.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you, first of all, Dan Cardell. What a pleasure and privilege to be with the Chicago quant community, and thank you, Glickman, for taking such a massive step down from, Ray Kurzweil and Ed Thorpe. You're used to talking to the legends. Here I am. So, just remember, this is about the least quanty talk you're going to hear in the entire 2 days, because once I flip to, is this the?
That's it, yes.
Okay. Once I make the pivot from the quantamental revolution to the topic du jour, there's going to be no equations. It's all, wishy-washy stuff. So it's going to be hard to pin down, right? That's the perfect sort of talk you want to give. But anyway, let's get started. Okay, so we're talking about the book. It's called The Quantamental Revolution. I wrote it for students. I've mentored lots of students from the various quant programs in New York, mostly Carnegie Mellon, some at Columbia over the years, UCLA as well. And that's, this whole thing really came out of that. And 514 pages, the book also doubles as a doorstop, maybe as sleep aid if you wish. No reason, but you're the experts here. You don't need to go through most of this. This is not news for you. You've all sort of grown up with the factor zoo. You've been tending it for a while. This is really more for the students who haven't been there and done that yet. But the first chapter is a little bit anecdotal. What I do is I trace out some of the, the students love this type of stuff. So the first chapter is written in the style of Michael Lewis. Aspirationally, of course, I'm not, anyway. Like Michael Lewis, but a bunch of little anecdotes that relate to my 30 years in the industry, having seen the growth of quantamental and factor investing. So that's what this whole chapter is about. We talk about banker's trust and the end of exotics and the early days of pricing derivatives and what got so many of us PhDs in quants onto Wall Street, things like that. The beginnings of the first Quantamental program, which I was fortunate to see that happening at Carnegie Mellon. I relate some random stories here and there about how we ran sort of simulated trading contests with Tokyo in 1994 when the internet didn't quite exist. So it required a satellite dish parked outside of the GSIA, which is now called the Tepper School. So there's some interesting stories in here, and maybe the relevant sections as I pivot to the main talk. Now that Dan convinced me that factor investing is old news and it's gotten a little commoditized, I think we may agree. And maybe I'm just sort of writing the epitaph at this point by writing the book, but it's all there if you want to read it. And the remainder. Well, let me actually just go back for a second if I can. Okay. And just sit through what's in the rest of the chapters. And I start with a survey of the literature, chapter 2. Your form of French and steroids. How do you navigate the factor zoo? You got hundreds of factors. How are you going to deal with the dimensionality reduction problem? So we take care of that and describe how we throw this machine learning ensembles at it. And boil it down to a bunch of smart betas, and then you take the smart betas and combine it into smarter alphas. That's pretty obvious. And then once you've got that, the central claim of the book is that you can do lots of things with it. So you can do your sector rotation and style analysis and regime dependence. Part of that chapter, by the way, is thanks to Petticombe and some of the work that he's been doing recently at Courant and John Mulvey over at Princeton. So I referenced the second part because I don't have anything original there. My stuff is in 7.1, which is much more rudimentary. In chapter 8, we've got some new results on on factor momentum using my definition of the smart betas, and this all culminates in kind of our archetypal kind of market neutral construct, which I call the hedge fund in a box. Not to be confused with some larger risk companies started using this term recently, but we've been publishing the hedge fund in a box for quite a while now, and we've been publishing it in conjunction with the Toronto Stock Exchange. I'll show you how that works, and that gets wrapped into QIS products with banks as intermediaries. I have another sort of thing which is more like quant or quantamental prediction of kind of replication of PE as a PE proxy. That's my leveraged buyout model from roughly 2000. That gets enhanced with NLP chatter. So chapter 11, I talk about how to incorporate natural language to try to pick up the chatter on mergers and buyouts and those types of things. That's a study we did pre-COVID with Ravenpack. And then in chapter 12, actually no, in 13, I revisit that study and show that you can actually enhance that now that you've got the transformer architecture. So I do have a little example of that. And then 12 is about the causal critique and some of the recent stuff that's come up in academia with the Prado's critique. So trying to address the causal critique. Is it a tempest in a teapot, or is there something more to it? So we take our smart betas and try to run it with the causal machinery. As I mentioned, there's a lot of anecdotal stuff in chapter 1. So we talked a little bit about our adventures with the events, and we've been blessed to have some great people hang out with us at the Frontis Tavern with Nassim Taleb and Peter Carr and Durbin and so on, and the Carhartt, the Carhartt manufacturer. So anyway, I already talked about this, I'm going to skip that. But this is basically the construct. You've got all the obvious kind of smart betas, and you combine them into various signals, your growth mode, qual mode, val mode, QMIT, et cetera, et cetera. I make up my own, the Enterprise 18, and blah, 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 but you can figure out how that goes. I've got a little website that shows the visualization aspect of this, and there's the main thing. So this is kind of the liquid alt space. We show that if you take the various liquid alts, and ours runs more in the QIS world, and you can set up some simple constraints. It runs on the Toronto Stock Exchange, as I mentioned, as the index. If anyone's interested, you can look it up. And now I'm going to pivot. So that's the end of, that's a swan song for factor investing. Let's get on with AI, because that's where the future is, right? So let's talk about the seismic, supersonic, tsunami disruption, what's headed our way, and how do we cope with this. Now, this part of the talk is very speculative. I'm just going to, detail some scenarios, and you be the judge. You can decide. There's much smarter people in this room who can figure out how to rewrite the textbooks, but I'm going to suggest that maybe capitalism is due for a reboot. Okay, but to start the journey, let's go back to the original AI stuff that I was trying to do in the 90s when I started my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and Herb Simon was still around. The original AI goes back to 1954 with Simon's logic theorist, and then shortly thereafter you had the Dartmouth Conference, and the rest was history. Everybody knows about Minsky and John McCarthy, et cetera, et cetera. What a lot of people don't know is, 1954 was a seminal moment when Herb Simon took the first 38 theorems from from Russell's Principia, sorry, not to be confused with Newton's Principia Mathematica, and proved a bunch of these theorems. And that was back in 1954. It's actually quite extraordinary that with the computational capability that was available back in 54, it was possible to do that. And of course, there are many other advances. I had a few other slides I skipped, but if you go back and look at so many things that happened in the middle, the nav labs and the hands-free across America, that was 95. I think nav lab was 1989, so long before Elon, there were autonomous vehicles being escorted across the country, so to speak. And then came Siri, or at least Nuance Communications. That was somebody in the same department, James Baker's company. Nuance Communications and Watson, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I remember I talked about the man versus machine episode in the book because, I was in the building at the Equitable Building, 757 7th Avenue when this happened. So this is one of the anecdotes in chapter 1. And if you look at, I describe how this all came about because you have the IBM team and Kasparov, and of course that, as we know, turns out not to be as difficult a problem as what Dennis Hassabis and others have done more recently. And so now we're going to start transitioning from the old AI to the new stuff, right? So, and this is a little bit non-trivial because a lot of people don't understand what happened very recently, right? Because you had the first generation of these so-called Gen AI programs, the LLMs and the transformer architecture, and the people who dismiss this say, well, it's just, stochastic parrots, next token prediction can never really understand the world. That's the Feifei Li and the Jan LeCun camp, and they have a valid criticism. But it turns out that, things have changed. By the time we got to the reasoning models, and what you have now is actually not just next token prediction, right? A lot of people don't understand that something very dramatic has happened in the recent past, and going to GPT-5 and the equivalent Gemini or Claude models, something pretty seismic is going on, because what the LLMs are doing now is they're actually they're simulating system 2 reasoning. So the valid critique was that the original LLMs, kind of your GPT-2 and what was released 3 years ago, November 22, 3.5 years ago, was basically just system 1. That's true. But now, and then my sort of immediate take on that was, well, why don't you just combine it with symbolic logic and, predictive calculus, and voila, you're going to get something that should be a lot more powerful. Well, it turns out that's not the road anyone's gone yet. I mean, Wolfram's been making noises about it, but I believe what's actually happening is that they've trained the LLMs now to with chain of thought and tree of thought and multi-step and RAG and all of these additional sort of things. They've made the LLMs approximate system 2 type of thinking, but the fact that it's not symbolic logic also means that there's a big difference. If you look at this little chart, it's not deterministic. This is very important. We're going to come back to this for financial applications. Secondly, it's not provably correct. So even if it's knocking off Erdos problems, you can't prove, you need something else to verify that the proof is valid. This is another big problem. And I mean, there's lots of problems, It's very logically brittle because it doesn't understand simple axioms of, transitivity, et cetera, right? So it can make very silly mistakes. And then typically what happens is somebody says, like just, I think yesterday someone highlighted that one of the LLMs didn't understand the concept of time. It couldn't time his run or something. So they then dismiss the entire thing and say, well, this is all nonsense. It can't even record the time. It must be, who can believe anything? Well, it turns out it's incredibly powerful. It's just, it goes to show the logical brittleness of the machine, that it's able to do some things that are incredibly powerful, and yet it's not able to do some very simple things. So there is still a very big missing, there's a big hole here that requires maybe the symbolic logic component, and that's why I tried to start with where it began with, kind of the system 2 expert systems, rule-based, and then, and by the way, a lot of mathematicians are doing this now with a different set of tools like Lean, and you've got a famous mathematician who just joined Axiom. It's a shop that's doing this as well. So, so that's where we are now. If you believe that, and Jeremy Avgad at Carnegie Mellon has some cool philosophical musings on this. I mean, the Jeremy and Terence Down, some of these folks are saying, well, it's going to be a hybrid approach, because what the LLMs have done is they've taken the quantitative hypothesis generation down to 0. So the good news is you can now generate lots of hypotheses. You don't need so many mathematicians to do that, and you can also make lots of attempts. So you can generate lots of hypotheses, you can try to prove them, but you still need the real expert mathematicians to figure out if it's a valid proof. Okay, so that's kind of where the world is headed, but you still need the verification, validation. There's still room for deductive reasoning, because when it comes to rigor and reliability, that's kind of the Achilles heel at the moment of these systems. Okay? So, by the way, this is chapter 13 of the book. So there's a reason there is a sort of logical pivot here. Just bring this out of the blue. But so chapter 1 and chapter 13, I talk about singularity and the agentic future. Now, when I wrote this last year, I've been talking about it for 3 years, but when I wrote it last year, it still seemed distant. And even until last week, when I was presenting this in recent weeks at Future Alpha and other academic venues, people thought it was a little crazy. I mean, the rest of the talk, which I haven't gotten to, I'm getting there, reinventing capitalism and so on. But I will point out that in just the last 48 hours, we've had We've had OpenAI drop a policy document that sounds awfully similar to what I'm going to talk about. So call that validation. Maybe you stole my thunder, but if you've already read that document, it's very actually philosophically aligned. But where I'm headed with all of this is sort of the big macro agon between capital and labor. How do we deal with that if one side has too much power? And I'm going to argue that basically in the world of AI with massive layoffs and disruption of labor, labor has no bargaining power left. That's the scenario we're headed towards, and so in that case, what can you possibly do? As the Lorenz curve flattens, Gini coefficient goes to 1, you get a bunch of trillionaires who extract all the rents, and the rest of us are unemployed. Where does that leave us? And not to mention be doomed in terms of, well, let's talk about some basics first. So I'm sure many of you have seen this chart from Anthropic. I'm sure this chart will continue to evolve rapidly as the blue portions, which represent what can be automated with AI, will continue to expand and cover all of that circular area, and the red will catch up with that over time. So right now, of course, the claim is that the observed AI coverage is only a fraction because, well, certain white-collar tasks are easier to automate, and the physical tasks are not, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to argue that's actually not true at all in a second, but let's start with the basics. So the main hope for humanity in this whole setup that, the folks who say, well, this is all alarmist because this Jevons paradox, once we extract all these efficiencies, the usage will multiply, and just like every time in history with the going from horses to automobiles, et cetera, it's not going to be an issue because everybody will use everything a lot more. And so that's one argument. And then the other point worth understanding is the so-called Moravec's paradox, where the claim is, well, it's easier for the machines to do things like, master chess than humans, and it's easier for humans to do certain things like grasp objects and, fold the laundry. But again, even that's not true anymore. So we're going to get to that in a second. Things are changing rapidly. That's the message, right? I mean, it's all very head spinning, and it's difficult to keep up with what's actually going on. But if you're plugged in, you might have noticed that we blew through the Turing, the Turing test without much hoopla, right? Most people, obviously, this is not a representative sample because everybody here is an outlier, so you may all be well aware of all the stuff that's happening, but the average public out there doesn't know that we blew through the Turing test, and I don't think most people are aware that we've now basically blown through AGI. And nobody's sort of, out there really announcing it, but Jensen Huang admitted it, tried to walk it back, Sam Altman said it, tried to walk it back. There are legal and other reasons why they may be walking it back, but it's very clear with the recent, what happened with the Anthropic Mythos episode, that they now consider the latest models to be too dangerous to release. I don't think that's just a PR stunt. I actually do believe that. And the main reason being that, you've got to the key the key requirement for AGI, which is RSI. So if you've got recursive self-improvement, that means now the robots are building the robots. You've got the AIs writing themselves, right? The next version of Claude is being written by this version of Claude. That's a different world. That's a very different world from the one in which we grew up writing C++ and having to compile the code. I mean, Claude can now write a C compiler in a matter of hours. That's crazy. You can write a whole C compiler from scratch. So it's different. You can't say this is just the same, right? So that's what's going on. Now, I'm sure many of you noticed that in more recent times, we've had some weird things going on, like Claude Bot and Open Claude, whatever the hell it's called. I mean, it's changed its name quite a few times, but OpenClaw, I believe, is the name that's sticking. So these OpenClaw agents can now take control of your computer and do all kinds of damage, right? They can. One of them was actually character assassinating somebody who was supervising some admin for a given forum. I forget if it was Reddit or one of these forums, because it didn't let them do what it wanted. So, I mean, the AIs are trying to deceive humans. They're lying, they're cheating, they're trying to harvest around, bitcoins and gain autonomy. So we're in a dangerous war. Okay, why? Because, well, first of all, they clearly are able to act autonomously, they have agency, they've got persistent memory, now they've got multimodal, and everything that, you know, the Ray Kurzweils of the world have been talking about for decades is now suddenly happening. And it's happening at breakneck speed. All of the law of accelerating returns, and, you know, once you hit the singularity, and I'm claiming we've crossed the event horizon. So now that you cross the event horizon, you're gonna see these model releases come, you know, every quarter and then every month, and, you know, I mean, you've noticed that pattern, right? So it's gonna get more and more frequent, and everybody tries to keep leapfrogging the other shop, and maybe the frontier model side of things will continue to get commoditized in some respects, but you know, and then of course there's a big security consideration, which all of you sane people in the enterprise and financial world with regulations would never consider doing crazy things like that, right? Where unless the Amazon Bedrocks and the NEMA clause at NVIDIA step up, nobody in their right mind would just take a Mac Mini and let it go crazy, right? And then that's what these open cloud type things do. Okay, so I'm claiming that, you know, the event horizon has been crossed because the singularity is sort of, it was a multi-year step function which came from the convergence of many factors. You could really maybe even trace it back to the Few Sharp Learners paper back in 2020, which was actually before OpenAI released their stuff in November of 22. So that's where we are. But now, I think we're in this phase of the intelligence explosion where things are gonna get they're really gonna go ballistic. Okay, so in theory, you could have math being solved, you could have physics being solved, you could have entire fields of, you know, cancer medicine and drug discovery being automated and at an incredible pace. And that's not, you know, not to account for this. Right? So once you get this, you get another step function. Because this was the last hope that, oh, well, you still need cheap labor to fold the laundry and do the dishes and, you know, clean the, well, maybe you won't have much of a debate about immigration because you won't need the cheap labor. Right? So the claim is once you've got physical AI and you got the, you know, you got a billion Tesla humanoids running around with AI in their heads or in the cloud, well, then what's left for humans to do, right? You can basically imagine a world very soon where there is no task, white collar, blue collar, not even the so-called plumber is safe now. Right? Because I've actually seen videos of these things where I mean, I'm sure you've seen the unitaries, the Chinese robots that are dancing and jumping around and doing somersaults. I mean, they've got the dexterity to do all the things you can imagine. Okay, let's drill down to finance now. So that's the very big picture, 10,000 foot. Let's talk about finance. What does this mean for the buy side and sell side and so on? Okay, well, obviously, if you can, if humanoids can do backflips, it shouldn't be too hard to, you know, automate the middle office paperwork, right? You would think that they can automate some of this type of compliance stuff. Now, there are things where you actually do want the AI, and I'm going to get to that part in a second. There are certain areas where you don't want the AI, at least not Gen AI to be involved. But there's lots of things like compliance where, you know, maybe you can pick up some patterns. And actually, look, the credit card companies have been using neural nets for quite a long time for fraud detection and things like that, right? But this is just much more advanced than that. And you could potentially see that in trade settlement and compliance, but also you can imagine automating every part of the research flow on the buy side, having an agent that does each part of the process, whether it's risk or portfolio construction, et cetera, et cetera. You could also imagine, well, I mean, if Claude can do, if it can spit out the DCF models, why do you need junior bankers? I mean, you can do the PowerPoints in a jiffy. Why do you need these kids pulling all-nighters, right? Different story. And so same thing with execution and so on. Now, arguably, a lot of that's already been automated. I'm going to get to that in a second. But clearly there are things that can be automated where arguably Gen AI and LLMs are much better. So I had this before that for things like, picking up one chatter, like with my, the example I gave of the natural language for earnings or Fed call, et cetera. You can try this experiment. So we used to do it with the old bag of words and Finword type of models, and now we've tried it with these, and of course it's better. It's much smarter. This is an example where, I had students try this last summer on, August 7th, Crocs report, stock beat on both earnings, so you got a double beat, but had poor guidance. Now, in the old days when you had the simpler models, they would have gotten confused, right? Because the older models were not smart enough to understand that, you had a double beat, but weak guidance, stock is down 29%. Is that good or bad? Is that positive sentiment, negative sentiment? It's going to get confused. But actually, in this case, you can see the sentiment is strongly negative. So I would argue things like this, it's very good at. There are things where you have to wonder, well, is it relevant? So in the mid to low frequency domain, the obvious thing to point out is, well, the data doesn't exist. The best case you have is daily or monthly data for CompuStat, et cetera, going back to, 1988 or something. That's in the US, and in many countries that doesn't even exist. So for all practical purposes, to do any kind of deep learning, you're going to need millions of data points, right? So you're not going to do anything sensible with neural nets for the most part that can add value unless you have that data. So I'm going to argue that for medium to low frequency investing, it's not very obvious that if, let's say, you're a Buffett Munger type of investor, it's pretty low tech. Anyone with the Yahoo Finance and a spreadsheet can do that. So what's there to automate? So let's move on. So clearly there's something in the higher frequency domains, and that's already been done. People have been chipping away at it in terms of there's applications to hedging and intraday, and even there's some nuance that maybe it's not good for execution because the latency is too much. So you can't really do HFT execution because the latency would far exceed what the current execution algorithms do. So let's talk about this. This is my favorite subject because this really gets to the heart of the matter. Okay, which camp are you in? Do you feel that there's a need for stochastic patterns, or are you happy with the deterministic cron jobs, right? So the point is that if you look at what quants have been doing for the last 30, 40 years, we're already fully automated, right? If you talk to any quant hedge fund or factor shop, what is left to automate? We've been doing all of this stuff just with cron jobs, and it's completely predictable. One job runs at 6 a.m., the next one runs at 6:30 and 7 o'clock, and yeah. So why do you need an agent that introduces all of this randomness into the process? Because the main problem with the AIs, at least in this context, is, and I don't know if I have a chart that gets into it, but my boarding school mate Mira Murati put out a new paper recently. So I don't know if you guys remember, she used to be the CTO of OpenAI before some turmoil. And there's a very technical issue with why these AIs give different answers. If you ask the same question 1,000 times, it'll give you different answers, right? This is a very big problem. If you're in a fiduciary capacity, can you legally defend that decision? If you start using these Gen AI models and you say, well, it gave me a different answer, and I gave him that portfolio, and I gave him that portfolio, and I don't know, it just gives different answers. That's the obvious legal issue. Okay. All right, so you can imagine that if you let these things run hands-off, which is the way they're describing the agentic future, you can easily have a Knight Capital type of algos run wild scenario, and everybody remembers what happened there. Or the Flash Crash episode with Waddle Reed, et cetera, et cetera. That's very conceivable. Okay, now let's get to the fun part of the talk. where people think I've gone off the deep end. But like I said, this is exactly what Sam Altman's talking about. This is exactly what Daria is talking about. This is now suddenly the widowed coastless, and everybody's waking up and saying, well, looks like AI is going to destroy all the jobs, and looks like we got this, utopia coming our way, but just so you know, some bad things could also happen. All right, well, let's just take stock of the good and bad. So the utopian possibilities are pretty obvious. If you can solve all of math and physics and material science and invent new, find new sources of energy and harvest the solar system and have Dyson swarms, deconstructing planets and the moon and infinite sources of energy, et cetera, that's fantastic. You can cure all disease and people can live a lot longer. Of course, we'll all be unemployed, so that's the problem we got to figure out now. Okay, so, there's lots of issues here that come up. One of the reasons they're saying that this new anthropic model is so dangerous because of zero-day hacks, because of, not just the obvious deep fakes, which clearly pose a threat to democracies, but I want to point out that even with simple social media, no democracy, no country in the world was able to effectively regulate social media, and that's been around for a while now. So realistically, what the chances that we're going to wake up tomorrow with a very enlightened policy? I'm not sure that's very high. So that's why I would say that you have to think about what is the realistic P2. Mine is pretty high because I'm betting on policy paralysis. I mean, my guess is that unless you have a 3 Mile Island, you're almost certain to have some major spill in the next couple of years. It could be a bioterror hack, it could be some other kind of major incidents, because what the AIs have done now is they put a nuke in everybody's hand. So it only takes one deranged individual, somebody who's depressed, somebody who just got laid off, going postal, if I can use that old term, going postal with AI. So it's very easy now to blow up the world with these tools, and nobody's going to do anything until you have a major, incidents, and we can only hope that it's small enough that not too much harm, but it sort of brings policy attention to the matter, which right now seems theoretical and sort of vague and distant, but it's coming. One of the other things that's coming is the loss of privacy. So most people kind of know this, but they don't want to talk about it. And certainly Mr. Mark Zuckerberg's not going to tell you what's happening, but look, I mean, once you have all of these devices like the Meta glasses, you're going to have 24/7 surveillance, and that's not just from the government standpoint, which people are understandably concerned about. That's a real issue, but I'm talking about just, everybody's walking around with Meta glasses or recording devices, different form factors, and you have the pendant. Everything's going to be recorded all the time. So we have to get used to the fact that there will be no privacy. It'll also be much harder to enforce IP rights because, the AI's already stolen everything. Good luck. If you're an artist, if you're an author, we'll see how anything gets enforced. So that's the real issue. Is how much can be enforced? Is it even enforceable? And maybe litigators will be very secure in their jobs for a little while. But okay, so let's move on. One thing worth understanding, of course, is that the biggest source of likely friction. I mean, in theory, all of this can go at breakneck speed, but obviously some industries are much more regulated than others. So finance is one of them, medicine's another one. So, the good thing in our industry is that, you've got lots of rules, and maybe that's a good thing. Government jobs is another example. Maybe the government jobs might be safer than the plumber's job. Anyway, so, all right. As I mentioned, there's going to be lots of things coming our way, and if you're a sci-fi fan, you're gonna love all this stuff. I mean, all the chatter about Dyson swarms and harvesting energy from the solar system and type 2 civilizations and the longevity sort of thing that's taken off. Everybody's becoming a biohacker and a longevity expert, right? We're now looking at potentially a future in the not too distant future, where the combination of AI and longevity and all of this sort of what I call the post-scarcity world leads to, all the assumptions of life that we're used to being turned upside down. And I'm going to get to that part. So the punchline is really, rebooting capitalism. But on the way, I want to hint at something else, which is near and dear to all of our hearts, because we've spent many years getting educated. And I'm wondering if, in this new paradigm, I would imagine that higher education gets disrupted easily. Think about it. I mean, why would you take on enormous amounts of student debt and go through many years of training as a doctor, 11 years to go through med school and this and that, if the AI can be a better radiologist? And we're going to have super intelligence soon that's going to be infinitely smarter. In parallel, you'll have infinitely many AIs that are infinitely smarter. We have no chance of competing with them. What is the point of higher education? Okay, and certainly the sort of typical traditional teacher in front of the classroom, not obvious how that all shakes out. We may have too many institutions, 3,000 colleges, maybe you're going to have a few that are still desirable for branding and networking purposes, but arguably there's lots of stuff in the middle which may get consolidated because AI is going to attack both the demand and supply side of the equation, right? So it's enabling the instruction on the one hand, automating it, but on the other hand, it's also making it killing the demand. So that's one of the I think one of the obvious is big losers are the lower tier, high tuition colleges. And that could be very similar to what happened with the SaaS apocalypse. Okay, so let's try to wrap up and get back to the key thing here, which is I would argue in the age of abundance, does capitalism make sense? And what does it even mean? Well, I don't know. I'm not a macro guy. But there are a lot of Chicago PhDs in this room, and hopefully somebody will figure out how to reinvent macro. So the claim is that once you've got the AI surfboards extracting maximal rents, and productivity is going to skyrocket, and you'll get exponential growth, and you've got abundance, and everybody's happy, except that they don't have jobs. That's the whole problem. So the surfboards are happy because you're going to get a bunch of trillionaires. And then on the right side, you got these knowledge workers that are suddenly obsolete, and just like the software companies. So what do we do with that? This is going to become a very big societal issue very soon, right? So I hinted at this phenomenon earlier. Once you have this extreme inequality and the Gini coefficient, goes towards 1, labor has no bargaining power. It is already true that there's one individual who's worth more than the bottom half of the country. Not the world. I mean, it's even worse if you measure the world, but just in the United States, there's one person who's worth more than half of the bottom half. So we're getting to the let them eat cake or let them eat tokens phase, where you're definitely looking at something calamitous happening. So I've talked about all of this before with the PDUM and Cambridge Analytica and all that type of stuff. But I would imagine that. You could be looking at a situation of social unrest because the Fed becomes impotent. I mean, just cutting rates or trying to stimulate the labor market doesn't work. I mean, you're just going to do a lot of QE and helicopter money. How is this all going to shake out? You're going to have to tax the trillionaires. You're going to need socialist policies like UBI. AI is sort of inherently deflationary. The cost of tokens will keep plummeting. The cost of intelligence will go to 0. But for now, in the short term, the binding constraints are energy and compute, and over time, even those will get solved, I'm arguing. So, somebody has to figure out what it means to live in a world where nothing is scarce. And, of course, in capitalism, you can't price anything if there's no scarcity, right? So that's really kind of the punchline, is that if you have no scarcity, if everything's abundant, what does it mean to own 1 million Porsches or Picassos, right? How much would you pay? And I'll just leave you with that thought. I know that we had the taco Tuesday trade, and you got the rally, and now you're ready for the tequila. So.
lot to process there. Lot to process. But I'm going to ask, who remembers the first really serious talk we had here on AI and predicted all of this stuff? Who was it and what year? As Dan talked about the, different things. I mean, Kurzweil was a whole nother level of like way back when. But Fred Almeida, remember Fred Almeida, stood here in 2017, right here in Vegas, and told everybody here, you have to use NVIDIA chips because it's the only one that worked. How many went out and bought NVIDIA? I did. And one of the worst mistakes of my life, I tripled my money and then get out. So it didn't work out so well. But Fred talked about all this in 2017. Subsequently, we've had a lot of presentations along these lines. But certainly a lot to think about. What's the story in the book? How much?
It's on Wiley.
Wiley, so it's just
and
$85.
Well, I didn't price it. I told them to price it for a student, but they priced it like a textbook, so.
Yeah, textbook.
Yeah,
Okay. $120.
I don't get it.
Okay, I know we're standing in front of the, we gotta get, but you're gonna hang around for dinner tonight.
Yeah.
So if you have some questions for him, let's go direct, because we're running a little bit late here. Once again, leave all your stuff here, it's okay. Don't leave any valuables or anything, we can leave everything else here. Name tags and everything for tomorrow. We'll be all set to go, but let's see everybody, 6 o'clock, cocktails start right across the street. Take you 5 minutes to get over there. So a quick stop at your hotel room or whatever, and we'll see you there for cocktails. Good first day here.